Afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is John Laffey, and today we're going to be going over some fundamentals of ISO 27001. A couple quick notes before we get started. All participants are muted for call clarity. These slides will be available shortly after the conclusion of this presentation at our website, pjr.com. If you click the training link, there'll be another link there where you can download these slides as well as all other past webinar slides. Additionally, if you search for our channel on YouTube, there will be a recording of this presentation as well as all other presentations we've given on a number of different standards and areas of expertise, which are all available to you for free. So I encourage you to check them out. Today, we're going to be talking about a few of the key parts of the standard. We're going to be looking at the requirements of the scope, the risk assessment and treatment processes, the statement of applicability, and how those three things fit together. We're going to be talking about information assets, what they are and what you need to be doing with them according to the standard. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about addressing hosted infrastructure and services as part of your information security management system. Additionally, if you have questions at any time throughout, please go ahead and use that questions tab to type them up. And at the end of the presentation, I will take as much time as necessary to answer any questions that you may have. All right, let's jump in. Let's talk about what the standard says your scope needs to have. It says that you shall determine the boundaries and applicability of the ISMS. And while you're doing this, the standard requires that you consider external and internal issues that are relevant to your organization, the information security related requirements of the organization's interested parties, and interfaces and dependencies between those things that your organization performs and those that are performed by third parties. And lastly, it requires that all of this be available as documented information. So let's take a closer look at what these requirements are and maybe dive into what that means practically. All right, so it talks about determining the boundaries and applicability. So when we talk about boundaries, you should be thinking about physical boundaries, informational boundaries, and organizational boundaries. So when we talk about physical boundaries, you can think of that as physical locations, offices, buildings, where the organization's activities are carried out. Informational boundaries would be defined by the specific information handled by the organization that you want to be in scope. In many cases, for many organizations, this is going to encompass all the information you handle because the way you're set up, it may not be practical to delineate between different types of information, as they very well may be using shared systems. And then organizational boundaries, this could be if there was only specific departments or functions included in the scope. Again, the ability to kind of cut organizational activities out is going to largely depend on the way your information systems are set up. And in most cases, all the users are going to be using common systems, so it makes it a little bit tricky to exclude certain groups of users. All right, and when we're talking about considering external and internal issues that are relevant to your purpose, an example of an external issue could be legislative or regulatory requirements. In specific, GDPR would be an example of an external issue relevant to an organization that collects information about individuals in the EU, right? So there's a lot of requirements in terms of privacy and what you need to do with that information and the notifications that you need to make to those persons that you're holding information about, as well as their ability to request information from you and potentially have that information erased. An internal issue could be a number of different things. Obviously, in the recent past, I would say the COVID pandemic probably was an internal issue for any organization, and figuring out how to continue operations, maybe remotely, maybe with reduced staff, but largely resulting in telework for a lot of your employees. Another potential example of an internal issue could be if a software development company is deciding to use outsourced developers. They're going to want to make sure that they're still meeting the information security requirements and they have a process in place to control that. Then the standard talks about information security requirements of interested parties. So an interested party is defined as a person or organization that can be affected by, or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. Some examples of interested parties and their potential requirements could include the owners of an organization. They may have a requirement that there's no information security related breaches that take place, as obviously that could cause financial and reputational damages to the company. A regulatory body can certainly be an interested party. So a regulatory body that oversees HIPAA, obviously, could be applicable to your company depending on what type of information you handle. And then typically the customers of an organization are always going to be an interested party. They're going to have some expectations about how their information is being handled and kept safe while it's in your custody. And then lastly, interfaces and dependencies between what your organization manages and what is provided by third parties. So typically, you're going to have an internet provider of some type, and that would be an interface that we would expect to be identified, that point of demarcation between where your network, your internally managed network, hands off to your provider's public network, and what safeguards are in place to ensure that you're still meeting your information security requirements. And then lastly, the scope being available as documented information. So this could be a written description. It could include charts and diagrams, network maps, lists. And in many cases, it's going to be a combination of those things. But there's also something that's going to be the certification scope, right? And that's going to be the actual written scope statement that goes on your certificate. And you're going to want to make sure that that is concise as possible, and that it accurately represents what your organization does and what's included in the scope of certification. Okay, so what is the impact your scope could have on your certification audit? So it's going to drive the number of locations and people under the organization's control that are included in the information security management system. The primary drivers of determining the duration of your audit are the risk level of the activities being performed, how complex your system is, and the number one driver is the number of in-scope employees and number of locations. Our recommendation is that you contact a registrar during the planning stages of implementing your ISMS. That way you can get some clarification on, if you are excluding personnel, is it appropriate? You can have some good dialogue with your registrar and set yourself up for success and being on the same page with how you guys determine your scope, and having a registrar say, yep, that makes sense to us, go ahead and go down that path. All right, risk assessment and treatment process and statement of applicability. Again, the standard requires that a risk assessment process be defined and applied. It needs to include risk acceptance criteria, as well as the criteria for performing the risk assessments. The standard also requires that this process results in an output of identifying your information security risks, identifying the owners of those risks, analyzing the potential consequences and likelihood of those risks actually happening, and then prioritizing the treatment of those risks based on that analysis. And after you've done that and identified, analyzed, and prioritized your risk treatments, you must utilize your treatment process in order to treat any risks that are above your acceptable level. Part of this includes determining all necessary controls that need to be implemented. And so what the standard does is it provides an annex of, I believe it's 144 controls that you are directed to go through, look at each control, see if it applies to your information security management system in your specific situation, and then either implement it, or if you feel that it does not apply, you can exclude it, but you also need to document your justification for why you felt that it wasn't applicable. Additionally, besides the controls in Annex A, you are certainly encouraged to implement any other controls that are covered in that list. While it is very comprehensive, obviously things change very rapidly, and there could be something that you feel as an organization is required for your information security risk treatment process. So you're encouraged to define any custom controls and also include those on your statement of applicability. On this slide here, this is just kind of a little snippet of a completely fictional made up statement of applicability. As you can see here, there's a column for the actual control, and that comes right from the standard, right? That A.8.2.1, that's that control number. That control itself is concerning the classification of information. So in this case, this company said, we are including it. The reason we're including it is a result of our risk assessment. So we performed a risk assessment. We found risks that would relate to not having a classification scheme in place. And so we decided to implement it. The implementation status is implemented, and then it also references a policy that actually talks about what that classification scheme is and how it's implemented. So that's kind of a little snippet. And obviously, you would have something similar for every single control in Annex A. So to try and summarize this, your risk assessment identifies the risks that require treatment. When determining what controls your company is going to implement, you reference all the controls in Annex A to determine if they are in fact applicable. If not, you justify their exclusion, and then you also want to document the current implementation status of the control. And that document that you record this information on is what is known as your statement of applicability. The statement of applicability is also going to be referenced on your certificate by version. So you want to make sure you have version control on that document, of course. And the reason for that is if over time your situation changes and you add additional controls that were previously excluded, or you exclude controls that you previously had implemented, we're actually going to have to reissue a new certificate that references the new version of the statement of applicability. All right, information assets. Information assets are comprised of the information your organization handles or processes, as well as the supporting systems that are utilized for that processing, storage, and transmission. Information assets can also include people, in addition to hardware, software, and networking, or I would just say infrastructure equipment. Identifying and determining the value of information assets in terms of criticality to operations, I believe, is a key component to an effective risk assessment process. This allows for prioritization of treating risks related to critical assets. So let's say you have a similar risk or the same risk, and one's related to a system that doesn't have sensitive information on it, and the same risk also is found to be present on a system that you handle confidential information on. It would make sense that you would prioritize, if you had to, if you couldn't treat them at the same time, it would make sense that you would want to take care of the risk related to the more critical system first. The standard also requires that you maintain an inventory of assets, and that each of those assets have a designated owner. That owner should be the person that can ensure that its inventory is classified appropriately and can define the access restrictions and handling procedures related to that asset. As far as what your asset inventory should look like, there's a lot of different ways to approach that. Some smaller organizations are able to maintain just some kind of spreadsheet, by hand, where they actually update anytime a new piece of equipment is procured, or a piece of equipment is assigned to a new user, or a piece of equipment changes status and is decommissioned. They go ahead and maintain all that by hand in a spreadsheet. There's also a number of automated tools that can do something similar. So there's a lot of different ways to approach this, but as long as you're meeting those requirements that I spelled out here, you're covered either way. A benefit of identifying your information assets is to ensure that when you conduct your risk assessment, you aren't missing anything. You're taking into account all of the information assets your organization is responsible for. Additionally, you want to make sure that the asset owners are assigned are knowledgeable and familiar with those assets and the role they play in your organization overall. You want to have a great list of resources to consult with when conducting your risk assessment. So you wouldn't necessarily want the asset owner to just be the finance department, because they might not be able to help you much in terms of the types of information security risks that might be related to those assets. So it might be, someone of a more technical nature would be the asset owner in that situation. And again, having a comprehensive and complete list of your information assets will provide clarity and confidence in knowing exactly what information you have in your possession. It's going to allow you to additionally identify all applicable information security related requirements to that information. So for some organizations, if this is your first time going through this process, it could be, pretty daunting, right? Because you're going to have to go through and actually catalog what you have, where it is, what kind of information's on it. So depending on how much you have there, it could be a big task, but it's definitely necessary to have that baseline understanding of what actually your organization is holding and handling and processing in order to then identify the requirements and risks and make sure that those are all being treated as necessary. All right, hosted services and infrastructure. So hosted services and infrastructure is very common in today's businesses. In a lot of cases now, the majority of an organization's information systems and processing may be taking place on these hosted platforms. In terms of the standard and its requirements, the most important thing to understand is that you're still responsible and required to ensure the protection of the information being processed and stored on those systems. Now, obviously, it's not feasible or appropriate for your ISO auditor to try and conduct a physical audit of the facilities of like an Amazon or a Microsoft. They're not going to allow it, and it's not practical because it could be across many regions, there could be replication in place, et cetera, et cetera. But what we will expect during the audit is that you can point to whatever it is you looked at that made you feel confident that they have the physical protections in place that you require. Now, this could be that they have an ISO 27001 certification themselves. It could be a SOC 2 report. In my experience, these large hosted providers have a number of compliance documentation and attestation available. So what we're going to be interested in is for you to show us, hey, this is what we looked at. Here's, I've downloaded their cert, I've downloaded their SOC report. This was conducted, on this date, and it's meeting all the requirements that we have. Additionally, there's a section in Annex A that's specific to supplier information security. Part of that is monitoring and measuring the performance. And part of that is also making sure that the requirements are spelled out and agreed upon in contracts or agreements. So that's another thing that we'll look at a lot too, is we'll ask to see, can you show me in your terms of service or your contract or your agreement language that speaks to information security and what you saw that made you feel comfortable in choosing this provider. As an example, this is talking about physical security, which I kind of mentioned before in terms of being able to show us what you looked at. But a lot of hosted providers, you still have the administrative access and control over those systems. So, there's been instances where I've gone into a stage 1 audit with an organization and they said, hey, we utilize AWS, so access controls aren't applicable at all. And then we had to have a discussion about, well, who's actually assigning, creating these accounts and assigning permissions. And well, we do that. Okay, well, then those controls actually are applicable to you. So just because it's a hosted infrastructure, it doesn't mean that those requirements aren't applicable to you. If you're still in control of that, then they are applicable. And even in terms of things like physical security, even if the other company is handling it, they're still applicable to you. It's just the way that it's being implemented is through the other company, through the hosted provider, I should say. I hope that makes sense. But in summary, if you're seeking ISO 27001 certification, you are still responsible for and must be able to demonstrate the manner in which information security threats are being identified and treated, whether it be on systems you own or those provided by those third parties. So overall, we just don't want to see an outsourcing of information security to where you're saying nothing is applicable to us because we use hosted providers. You still have to do the due diligence and be able to demonstrate how they're meeting those requirements that you've determined. Okay, and that is all I have prepared here. So I'm going to pop open the questions tab and pop that out. And at this time, please feel free to type any questions you have, whether it be specific to what we just talked about or ISO 27001 in general. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Additionally, if you'd rather contact me personally, my email address is on the screen. It's jlaffey@pjr.com. Feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have in that manner as well. All right, here we go. Janice asks, if you are CMMC certified, can you be ISO 27001? Janice, you certainly can. Now, I know the CMMC requirements are different, so obviously you're still going to have to go through the process of implementing all the requirements of ISO 27001, but being CMMC certified would not prevent you from being ISO 27001 certified. I just don't think it would automatically mean that you're meeting those requirements. You're still going to have to do a comparison of, I know the controls in CMMC are a little different than ISO 27001, and ISO 27001 also has some more kind of management system requirements about management reviews, internal audits, things of that nature. But yes, you can absolutely be both. Thank you for your question. Mallory asks, how long does the certification process take? So once we come in, this is this is after you've already done your implementation. So we'll do your stage 1 audit, depending on the size of your company, that's typically going to be 1 to 2 days. The stage 1 audit, we're just looking to verify that all of the fundamental pieces are in place. So we're not going to be looking at individual pieces of objective evidence showing that you're doing it all at that point. We're just looking at the scope, your statement of applicability. We're verifying you have a risk assessment process in place. You've done an internal audit and a management review. So if all that looks good, we typically recommend 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks between the stage 1 and stage 2. Just in case we find anything at the stage 1, you have enough time to correct that prior to the stage 2. And then the stage 2 audit, again, it's going to totally depend on the size of your company, but it's going to be somewhere between 3.5 to 7 days at the higher end typically. So from start to finish, you could realistically have your entire certification audit done within a month and a half to 2 months. What is to be expected during a 4th year recert, and how is it similar, different than stage 1, stage 2 audit? From Eddie. So the recert audit, Eddie, it's going to be similar to the stage 2 audit. It's going to be slightly less long in duration because we're already familiar, or the registrar is already familiar with your system at that point. But it's going to look at every control section in Annex A and every numbered clause requirement in the standard. So it's going to feel similar to the stage 2 audit, just without the stage 1 part. How does ISO compare and/or complement CMMC/NIST SP 800-171? We are far in the process of implementing NIST and are looking into CMMC. What's the added requirement steps for ISO? This is from Jose. So, and I'm not a complete expert on the NIST requirements, Jose, but largely, I believe the NIST platform is mostly just controls related to information security. The big difference with ISO is that it has some requirements around a management system in general. So that's going to require things like top management commitment, like top executives are going to be audited and have to demonstrate how they've participated in communicating the importance of the management system. There's going to have to be measurables or metrics, so you have to define goals and set targets that you're looking to achieve, whether it be monthly, annually, whatever the case may be. Internal audit is a requirement of any management system where you have to actually basically conduct an audit like a third-party auditor would of your system, write findings as you see them, you have a corrective action process to rectify those. And then there's something called a management review, which is a meeting that takes place on a regular basis. It's to include all top management, and there's a number of required items you have to discuss during that and take actions on as necessary. So the main difference, I'd say, is the management system requirements. There's also some differences depending on which NIST framework you're looking at in terms of number of controls. Like I know for CMMC level 1, it's certainly a lot less controls than is required in 27001. Mallory asks, does ISO 27002 help with ISO 27001 process? Absolutely, Mallory. So ISO 27002 is a guidance document that takes kind of a deep dive into all the controls in Annex A of 27001 and provides examples and guidance of what implementing those controls look like. So ISO 27001 just kind of gives you a brief description of each control. 27002, I'd say it's if you're doing this yourself and implementing it from scratch, I'd say it's almost required that you have that document as well, because it's going to be invaluable in terms of filling in the gaps of understanding of what it actually means to implement those various controls. Richard asks, if we are CMMC certified and ISO 9001 certified, the process could be implemented by generally revising programs to address 27001. Richard, it certainly could. You could take the approach of having an integrated 9001 and 27001 system. There is a lot of overlap between the two standards in terms of like those management system requirements I was talking about. There are some deltas between the two standards, so you would have to have sections probably devoted to each standard for some of those numbered clause requirements. But yes, you certainly could leverage a lot of what you have in place with your CMMC controls and your ISO 9001 system to become 27001 certified. You just have to make sure that you did a gap assessment between what 27001 has and what you have currently, and make sure you fill in all those gaps. But it should give you a leg up that you already have a 9001 system in place. All right, great questions, guys. Keep them coming. Obviously, if you don't have any more questions, that's I just want to again thank you all for joining me today. Again, you can find this presentation at pgr.com or on our YouTube channel. Additionally, you can reach out to me directly, jlaffey@pjr.com, if you have any other questions. And you can contact PJR at 1-800-800-7910. And our team there will get you in touch with the right folks. If you're thinking about starting the registration process, it's great to reach out to a registrar as soon as possible, just to kind of have them there to guide and make sure that they understand, like I mentioned, the scope and that it makes sense to them. And can start talking about what your timelines are in terms of expectation for getting your certificate, because we do book out months in advance with our auditors for this. So it's better to involve the registrar earlier rather than later. Richard, you are quite welcome, sir. I'm glad to help. All right, guys. Well, again, thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Take care.